Hello there and welcome once again to The Verdict. Mick Cornett with Kent Myers. We're glad you're here. We're here every week. We meet interesting people and deal with topical issues, and we return a guest today who was inspiring so much deep thought on our last occasion that we felt like we needed to bring him back in.
Well, we did, and that is Marc Nuttle, who's going to talk about the world debt situation as he did just last week on our show. We're going to continue that and hopefully get to a solution to the world debt problem. We did receive a good bit of comment and commentary from you viewers, which we appreciate very much, asking about what Marc had said and could we get him back, and we've been lucky enough to capture him, so we'll visit with him today.
Well, the world economy is in some level of a crisis, and Marc will be here to explain just how serious it is and how it affects us right here in Oklahoma. It's today on The Verdict.
It's time, America. Our energy future can be ours again with American natural gas. We have an abundant, affordable supply, unrivaled anywhere. $1 billion a day for importing foreign oil isn't just a statistic, it's an opportunity. 30% lower greenhouse emissions isn't a pipe dream, it's a choice. Now is the time. Chesapeake, America's champion of natural gas.
Wilsey, Meyer, Eatman, Tate. We're accountants. We do taxes, business valuations, estate planning, and consulting. And we're right here in Oklahoma, working with the owners of small and medium-sized businesses. Steve Wilsey and Stuart Meyer have the resources and the experience. Wilsey, Meyer, Eatman, Tate in Oklahoma City and Tulsa.
Welcome back to the set of The Verdict. Mick Cornett with Kent Myers, and Kent's going to introduce today's guest.
Today we're really happy to welcome back for his 6th appearance on The Verdict our guest from last week, Marc Nuttle. Marc, as you may recall, is an attorney, lives in Norman. He has much experience in international trade and finance matters and political affairs in both nationally and internationally. He served as an advisor under President Reagan. He has advised foreign governments, including Bulgaria, the Ukraine, and Russia. He is studied the national debt crisis, the international debt crisis, in some great degree, and is here to talk to us today to give us the rest of the story that we weren't able to finish last week. Marc, welcome back.
Thank you.
Glad to have you.
Happy New Year.
For those who missed last week's show, can you give us a capsule of what that show was about and a preview of where we're going today?
Sure. What we're talking about is world debt and world deficits. Every country in the world except China is borrowing money right now to some extent. The world's ability, the world's economy's ability to fund these deficits is in jeopardy. We're approaching what we call a debt wall. The definition of a debt wall is when a country cannot borrow money to fund its deficits at a rate that it can afford, i.e. Greece today. You can still borrow money, but you have to pay an exorbitant interest rate for it. The United States will be the last country to face that debt wall, but more and more debt walls are pending.
And that's because credit ratings aren't what they were.
Well, that's one thing, and it's not just about debt, it's about deficits. The amount of money each government is overspending its revenue in the world today.
I see a lot of attention on Germany, and as if the European issue could partially be resolved or maybe totally resolved if Germany would be a player and take a little more of a universal view. What's your thoughts on their role?
Well, Germany's a sound economy, and their debt to GDP is high, but their deficits are under control. Now, what France and the rest of the European community wants Germany to do is to underwrite Euro bonds, which would be bonds that is issued by the ECC in Belgium that all have to pay. So therefore, Germany underwriting the deficit spending of all other Eurozone countries. And they're in a catch-22. The French are arguing, President Sarkozy to Chancellor Merkel, look, if you don't do this, the euro is going to break up, the euro currency will be diluted, and you'll pay a price for that greater than underwriting it. The Germans are looking at this and going, maybe we should just cut our losses right now. And they refused to underwrite the overall debt of the 18 euro countries. And that's the situation they're in right now. And I don't think they're going to do it.
And if they don't, there's a short list of solutions there.
Yes.
Well, was this predictable back at the time the euro system was formed, that we were likely to be in this position?
Kent, there were criticisms. This all started back in the 1970s.
Yeah.
And there were criticisms then that there were two things that had to be done if the euro was going to survive as a zone first and as a currency. One is that they had to release the flow of labor, to be able to cross borders and find the cheapest job at the best rate pursuant to skill. Like in the United States today, you and I don't have to have a passport to travel in between states, and you can migrate to another state to find a job if you want to. The history of Europe allowing for the borders to be that porous was something they couldn't comprehend. They wanted to work their way into it in theory rather than reality. It didn't work. The second is that each euro country has its own treasury and prints its own money. And it was supposed to be bound to a formula of not deficit spending more than 2.5% of its gross domestic product. I'm not sure they ever achieved it, but certainly in the last 20 years they haven't. Greece has been deficit spending beyond 2.5% for 20 years. They kind of turned their head and let them do it because they wanted this to all work out. It's just this hope that, okay, if we just don't address it by the reality of the physics of economics, somehow it'll work out. Now put that into U.S. terms. What if every state had its own currency tied to the dollar? And the Federal Reserve is trying to manage a dollar based upon what Mississippi spent versus Oklahoma versus Texas versus California versus Massachusetts versus New York. How would that work? Mm-hmm. And how would we feel now about bailing out California's deficit if they were spending their own money, saying you've got to issue bonds, Oklahoma, that underwrites our debt? Now, we do it now through taxes, but that's different than issuing debt. That's the difference. And so the critics then would have said that wouldn't work unless you course correct those things then. They didn't do it, and now they're at the point of reality.
What was the overriding reason to go to the euro and the system and from the system that had been in place?
Well, the term then was that they wanted to become the United States of Europe. And so everybody wanted to mimic the United States of America. It's a free enterprise system. And what we've had in our Constitution that's been upheld since the Founding Fathers called the Interstate Commerce Clause. No state can impose legislation that impedes trade between states for the good of that state, or it's tariffs by state. That's what they wanted to achieve. I mean, the United States model works. You know, we're the greatest economic engine the world has ever known since the Roman Empire. And people have been trying to mimic it based upon their culture and their history, like wire it so it fits their culture, so the public would be able to handle it, and at the same time get the best benefits of the United States. So that was the point. That's why they did it. And a joint economy, a joint currency, 300 million people to match the size of our economy. There's a lot of economies of scales to have a United States of Europe that work in the United States of America. That was the idea. Okay,
well, how well did it work? What's the follow-up now? I mean, so it has not worked? Is that the takeaway?
Well, no, it hasn't worked because they didn't control their deficit spending. Mm-hmm. Tony.
So what you're really saying, Mark, is that these countries don't have the ability to pay the debt out of their operating or on an ongoing basis.
Well, first, I think maybe one point that I just thought of. Tony Blair was just here at the end of the year, and he made a very interesting comment to the question about European debt in the question and answer period. And he just said something that he would have never said as Prime Minister of Great Britain. He said, if Europe does not change culturally, it will not survive. And what he meant, and then he went on to elaborate, what he meant by that is the entitlement mentality of the landlord-tenant relationship, which was the king takes care of the tenants, and the tenants worked to support the state so they have a job. That was the European mentality throughout the Middle Ages and up till 1900s. And if that doesn't change, and where each country is responsible for its own goods and services, and people become more independent, they will not survive. That's what he meant. Now, what's happened, Mayor, is that they have finally reached a point where their debt is great enough, the cost of their debt, and the world collectively looking for deficit spending that they can't afford to borrow the money to continue the deficit spending. That's the debt wall.
And they have, up to this point, been having to rely to some extent on U.S. banks for assistance in staying afloat up to now. Well,
yes, there is bank-to-bank relationships, but Europe, and particularly as the European community developed, and some of the, it hasn't been that long since the Eastern Bloc states came online. It used to be Czechoslovakia up until 1994. Now it's Czech Republic and Slovakia, and Romania and Poland. And when the wall came down, the transformation of these economies from total command to open economies has been very difficult, and transition's not been easy. And to your point, Kent, what they were able to do is go to the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund and borrow money at world rates to be able to support the transformation of these economies. You mentioned I worked in Bulgaria for a while. I worked on that constitution and how they transformed from a Soviet economy into a world economy. And it's the IMF that allowed them to do that. And the United States of America supports, as its percent of the largest country in the world, IMF and the World Bank.
Let's take a break. We'll get back with more. I want to understand China's role in the world economy and how they might be a partner or an enemy to all of this going forward.
Well, and then we want to get to the final answer.
Absolutely.
The answer? Yeah.
Marc Nuttle today on The Verdict. We'll be right back.
The thing that has made the most sense for me is realizing that I am still an educator, and that is what I do at the Chickasaw Nation. I'm Dr. Amanda Cobb-Greetham. I'm a historian, and I'm Chickasaw. The Chickasaw Cultural Center is amazing. It is a very, very special place devoted to the sharing and to the celebration of Chickasaw history and culture. State-of-the-art technology, exhibits that are not like anything I've ever seen. The Spirit Forest is incredible, and you feel as if you have actually just walked into a forest with huge trees all around you. It's timeless, and yet it's sort of also representative of our time depth, to really just sort of reach through time and touch the past. By the end of the exhibits, you really have a sense of Chickasaw cultural and political resurgence, and the extent to which we are a healthy, dynamic, and vital tribe today. Chickasaws have always been an inclusive people. This is something for the whole community and for the state of Oklahoma.
In 25 years, world energy demand will grow by 44%, with oil and natural gas largely meeting the need.
The question is, will America's demand be met by American resources?
Oklahoma says yes. We're developing the largest oil and natural gas discoveries America has seen in 40 years.
It's creating jobs and millions in tax revenue for schools, roads, and hospitals.
Oklahoma's oil and natural gas industry, advancing our state, empowering our nation.
When you have something important to communicate, it becomes clear that there's a lot of competition for your audience's attention. So how can your message stand out and actually resonate with your audience? Legal Graphics has the answers. The team at Legal Graphics will work with you to plan, design, and even test your presentation to ensure your message will be heard and remembered. Call Legal Graphics today to schedule an appointment. The readiness is all.
Welcome back to the set of The Verdict. Mick Cornett with Kent Myers. We're visiting with Marc Nuttle on the world's economy. What recent developments have taken this in one direction or the other?
Well, there have been two, Mayor. One is the S&P has downgraded just recently in the last week France and Italy's bond rating, which means they'll have to pay a higher interest rate for the money that they're going to borrow in the future. It further impacts the European community's ability to issue these bonds that we've talked about for bailout, because part of it is the full force and effect and guarantee of the sovereign nations involved in the EC. And now that their bond ratings have been downgraded, the overall fund will be downgraded, and the rates will go up. Now, and then the other development is that since our last show, the OECD, which is the National Foundation for Economic Data for all governments that we all rely upon other than the IMF and the World Bank, issued a report in late December that their projections for sovereign debt financing was over 10 trillion. Now remember on the last show, I had it projected at 6.3 with only about 5.4 available, meaning you can get more money, but you've got to pay higher interest rates for it to pull out of the stock markets, basically. Now they're also including debt that has to be refinanced, but they issued the report to say that they didn't believe that 10 trillion was there readily at a cheap rate. It's exactly what we're talking about. So we, I don't know if we can see this chart. We showed this chart the last time, but this has happened before, if you can see this chart. Just real quickly, QE1 is the point where we hit the wall once before. This is in 2009. The United States government printed money for the first time in the history of the country, $600 billion, printed it and paid debt with it. And QE2 was part of that where we loaned it to ourselves. Most projections now, including Goldman Sachs, is that we will hit this wall again on QE3. Now what will we do with quantitative easing 3? The Federal Reserve is talking about printing money again, or the Treasury prints money and issues it through the Federal Reserve to pay debts to keep, why? To keep interest rates down. This is what this is all about. Printing money to keep interest rates down because we've hit a wall of liquidity of the world's ability to pay all this sovereign debt.
Mm-hmm. All right, we talked a little bit in the last segment about China being the one country that seems to have at least some sort of in the black. Talk about their potential role in this. Is it in their best interest for the rest of the world to pull out of this, or is it in their best interest for the world to continue to spiral into deeper debt?
Well, China, let's take them on their word. That's another day's segment on Chinese economy, a communist government, a command economy, provisional governments and how they all work. As you know, I worked in China for several years, and it's a whole different environment. But let's take them on their word, they're in the black. What happens? 80% of their GDP is required for trade and export to other countries, primarily the United States and Europe. Goldman Sachs' first of the year report is they're predicting a 3% growth rate for the world's economy, recession possibly in Europe, in the United States of America, flat or minor growth. I don't know how they predict world growth for China if Europe goes back in recession, but let's take it as it is. If we're flat, they will not grow at the 8 to 9% that they need. But your question is, what is China's role in this? China needs to export. And China's concerned, they do have to buy strategic materials, primarily oil, overseas still. They've got some shale they're developing, but it's not online yet. They have to buy this in dollar, guys. I mean, the dollar, remember, is still, in my opinion, the world's primary currency, not its secondary currency. Oil is bought in dollars. If we don't manage our currency properly and we spend money and we go into quantitative easing 3 to keep interest rates down, there's an impact on commodities, which costs China money. So China is entering into relationships now with Venezuela, Russia, and most recently Japan, where they buy strategic materials in yuan, their currency. And they're not trying to replace the dollar, they're trying to establish a market wherein they have a currency in which they can buy strategic materials for their needs, and that's what China's doing. They're rapidly trying to develop a middle class, but China cannot consume internally what they produce to maintain an 8 to 9% growth rate.
Okay.
Mark, what do you think is the solution? How do we get out of this? How does the world get out of this?
Well, I know it seems, this seems to be a simple statement, but there has been numerous testimonies from experts in front of Congress that the number is $400 billion has to be cut out of the current budget now. And that's based upon world needs.
That's U.S. budget.
U.S. government budget. And it's about 10%. Now let's restate that number again. Roughly, the United States government spends $4 trillion a year on $2 trillion in income. The actual numbers from the CBO is 2.1 on 3.8, but in a given month, 4 on 2, we're overspending our budget 100%. So 400 billion is 10%. Now that's not easy because 80%, no, almost 90% of the budget now is set by formula. Only 12% is discretionary spending, meaning you've got to cut into entitlements. You've got to, there's formulas that are set that we need to massage. But guys, we can do 10%. And it would send a signal to the world that we are going to manage our currency. The dollar would remain strong. Currency would continue to flow here for safe haven. Our interest rates would be low. And it provides another $400 billion to the liquidity of the world to fund other countries. These debt walls are coming, starting with Greece, and they're starting to come back. The smaller the country, the less stable the currency, the quicker they hit a debt wall. As these debt walls come this way, the United States, remember 30% of our GDP, our gross domestic product, is dependent upon trade with the rest of the world. If Italy fails, Japan is somebody else to watch. For any reason those countries pull back on our strategic needs for trade, our GDP is hurt, our deficits go up for unemployment and other things, and we go into our own spiral. We cannot survive without the rest of the world surviving, particularly when we control the primary currency. So cutting $400 billion. The second thing we need to do is block grants back to the states for at least two agencies. You know, Ron Paul's right about this, by the way. Maybe one of the few things I agree with him on, but I agree with on this. The Department of Energy and the Department of Education, you could close those agencies. Send, not cut any budgets, send the money back to the states. There's a Secretary of Energy and a Secretary of State in every state to take the money and properly apply it. You still have inspectors, federal standards on what to do with the money, how is it spent, but you could cut the bureaucracy by 50,000 employees. Close those agencies and give the states their rights back under the 10th Amendment, let them administer those funds. I guarantee you that Janet Barisi could handle the Department of Education's funds just fine, and let her be the monitor of that money and how it's applied. Now, those two categories alone, through duplication and savings of the federal government, save about $250 billion a year. Now you cut 400 across the board, and it's not even. The military might be 12, and Medicaid and Medicare through mean testings might be 8 or 6. But it can be done if we had the will of the public to do it and elected officials who would do it. Now you're at a point where you're actually managing the world's currency, the dollar, properly. There's enough money for it. $400 billion goes a long ways to a bunch of other countries to be able to apply for these funds worldwide. And we help them. This ought to be done through the G20. The G20 ought to meet and face this debt crisis and say, this is how we're going to do this together with the leadership of the United States of America. Then we would get through it. We wouldn't have to go to quantitative easing 3. We wouldn't have to print the money. We wouldn't have to scare China or anybody else anymore. The dollar would stabilize. Oil and gas prices would stabilize. And by the way, it would help the budget of Oklahoma, by the way, because as the world survives and needs oil, it's the second source of income for the state of Oklahoma in our budget.
Okay, now explain how the contents of this show affect a person in Oklahoma who has a job, they go to the bank, they use an ATM card, they have money. How does the world economy affect their life and their quality of life?
Well, two ways. We don't have any prime banks in Oklahoma, so we don't set prime interest rates. The cost of capital is a world formula. And we don't set oil prices in Oklahoma. It's a world formula. The number one source of revenue for the state budget, by the way, is state income tax. And if the United States of America's economy flattens out or goes into recession, we reflect that. We're usually a lag indicator, starts on the coast and comes here, but it will impact our companies, it will impact our products, it will impact our economic matrix, if you will. If we print the money, and to your point about an ATM, I don't predict inflation anytime soon because it requires growth. You have to have demand for money for there to be inflation. You can still print this money. And they could probably buy some time with it, but it's not the answer. Printing the money is not the answer. Getting control of our budget is the answer. A sound dollar, a sound economy is the best thing we can do for the economy of Oklahoma.
All right. Mark, we got about 30 seconds left in the show. Sum up what you want our viewers to take away.
Well, okay. In summary, what we know is that you cannot borrow and spend forever. Between Paul Krugman of the New York Times, who wants to spend money, which I disagree with, or Warren Buffett, who's in Time Magazine right now, and some things I agree with what Mr. Buffett says. I have the highest regard for him, and maybe we should raise some taxes and some revenue or just things, so there's a formula. But it's unanimity among all of us that these numbers are unsustainable. And that if something isn't done, we will hit a wall, whether it's now or next year or within 2 years from now. What everybody should understand is that we must support politicians who want to do something about this and be aware of that formula for the good of our grandchildren.
Got to cut it off there. Marc Nuttle, our guest today on The Verdict. Thanks very much, Mark. It'll be interesting in this election year how all this plays out.
Thanks for coming back.
Thanks, Kent.
Kent and I'll have a final word when we get back.
good life comes naturally to Tulsa, where nature's beauty is matched with an eye for aesthetics. A legacy of neighborhoods graced with lawns and landscaping and handsome homes. A place that seems to have patented an ideal lifestyle. Bank First is loyal to the quality of life Tulsa assures its citizens, to the priority placed on education, culture, and growth. Loyal to builders who transform raw land into residential charm. Developers who see opportunity and add vitality to Tulsa's economy. Bank First serves both enterprise and private lives that need a loyal partner. It's how we help nurture this city's very good life. Bank First. Loyal to Oklahoma. Loyal to you.
In Oklahoma, we enjoy a high quality of life due to good, well-paying jobs. Commercial real estate professionals play a significant role in bringing new businesses and investments to Oklahoma. The commercial real estate community has come together to market Oklahoma's commercial properties nationwide through a free public website, okcommercialproperty.com. We are invested in keeping Oklahoma strong and growing because economic development ensures quality of life.
The Journal-Record is pleased to be a sponsor of The Verdict. The Journal-Record, since 1903, the best source of Oklahoma business news and legal information. And for almost 30 years, Oklahoma political, government, and business leaders have turned to the McCarville Report for accurate, reliable, inside information. Visit the McCarville Report online.
Welcome back to the set of The Verdict. We are wrapping up a show with Marc Nuttle, who leaves us with a lot to think about.
Indeed, he's got a lot of good ideas.
That's right. Cut the budget 10% would be a good way to start, but we're spending more than we're taking in.
Wise but painful.
That's right. Europe certainly right in a lot of people's focus here on the world economy. Marc Nuttle, our guest today on The Verdict. I want to send you to our website and let you see how you can be a part of determining future guests on the set of The Verdict. You can go to our website at theverdict.tv and tell us about a show you'd like to see or a guest you'd like us to visit with. That's going to do it for this week's show. Our thanks to Marc Nuttle for coming in. For Kent Myers, I'm Mick Cornett. We will see you next week and every week right here where another episode of The Verdict.
The preceding program was produced exclusively for the Cox Channel.